So I think we're going to get started. My name is Zoran Sosnick. I'm a FOLIO implementation consultant at EBSCO. And thanks for coming to this session. I know it's for at least the folks here at the conference. This is the last session of the day. I am the only thing staying between you and dinner. So I am going to try to keep an eye on chat for those folks online, but I will definitely make a point to check it at the end to go over any questions or comments. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right, so hopefully you're not here just because I have the title that I chose and referencing Lord of the Rings. But I'm here to talk about consortial ERM migration that I was a part of earlier this year. I'm not going to spend too much time on myself. This is just my background. I have a lot of experience with e-resources. That's kind of the quick takeaway from this. I'm active in the community. I work closely with Owen, the ERM product owner, and a few other folks in this room. I've worked with a variety of products. I've done migrations outside of the FOLIO realm before I joined EBSCO. So I have quite of a wide range of experience, not just of like doing data things, but also doing ERM work, working with ERM data. So I try to use this experience in my implementation work, in my project management. So a little bit about Mobius. I'm going to move this somewhere. There's an easy way to get rid of it. I haven't used Zoom in a while. Okay, so a little bit about Mobius. So Mobius is a library consortium in the U.S. state of Missouri that was previously on Sierra. And there's about 62, 63 libraries. Yeah, it's a name. One library was added in the middle of our implementation, so I can never remember the exact number. But I think it was 60, 62 or 63. They began migrating to FOLIO in the spring of 2023. Really, the implementation started in the fall of 22 with planning and stuff, but like the real kind of work started on it. It was coordinated by their central office, so they have a consortial office. I'm going to kind of refer to them as MCO, so Mobius Central Office. And then we had our implementation team at EBSCO. So it was a pretty big project, lots of people involved, different divided up. I was actually responsible. There was two implementation folks on it, myself and my colleague, Robert. I did the ERM and the acquisitions aspect, and Robert did the other parts of FOLIO, the non-ERM parts. And then we had separate folks for doing the data migration. Some of them are in the room. I'm not going to call them out. But so this was a big project in the general sense because this is the first kind of implementation of FOLIO, the FOLIO enhanced consortial support model. So instead of one tenant with 62 libraries on it, it's like a one central tenant and 62 subtenants. And I'm going to get into the details of the architecture because it actually doesn't matter for ERM. And that's kind of the point of this whole presentation in this project. The ERM part of this project. So this is a large project. It is 60, and you see the numbers change from 62 to 60. There was 3 libraries in this consortium that were already live on FOLIO ERM, so I didn't have to migrate their data. Their data was just like at the end, it was transferred into, on the back end. So that lowered the number from 63 to 60, which is still a very large number. ECS, for like cataloging purposes, you share records. There's a central record that everyone kind of attaches holdings records to. And that way, from a data migration perspective, we were able to load all the records in at once and they populated out. And that's a very gross simplification of what happened. And I see my colleague over there vibrating with the reductionism that I just did there. But my point in saying that is this did not apply to the ERM. It does not apply to organizations, it did not apply to agreements, it did not apply to licenses. That all had to be done as and treated like, ye old normal FOLIO migration, where you're just migrating one set of data for one library. But there's 60 of them, and the majority of them did not have any sort of ERM system in place before. They were, like I said, they were on Sierra. A few of them were kind of using, if you're familiar with Sierra, IIII Sierra, it has an ERM module, but it's not a very modern one. That's the word I'm going to use. In the sense it doesn't have a KB attached to it. Anyway, I don't actually have a ton of experience with it other than what the data I got from like one library migrating it. So I'm trying to not get into the details. But the majority of these libraries are smaller. They're not. Some of them are community colleges. Some of them are just very small, like private religious institutions in Missouri. So they just don't have the time or the staff, or frankly, in some cases, like a ton of electronic resources or the budget to require sophisticated, centralized, like holistic ERM work before this. So we have that challenge as well. So we have, not only do we have a lot of libraries, a lot of potential data, we have a lot of libraries that, all the libraries know how to do circulation. All libraries know how to deal with cataloging records. Not all the libraries really know all the electronic resources they even have, let alone how to manage them or where to put them and stuff like that. So, and like I said, there's no way to do this all at once in one push that we were able to figure out in the time frame of this project. It had to be done one tenant at a time, essentially 60 sets of data, actually more than it ended up being 2 sets of data per library 60 times, so 120 loads of data essentially. So we had several options to this. So the kind of default solution was have the libraries populate the data themselves. They know their data. We don't actually know all of their electronic resources. EBSCO as the vendor, the implementing vendor. It reduced the time of the project from the sense that there wouldn't really be a project. The libraries would just be on there. We would show them how we would do the introduction overview of FOLIO ERM, like how it works. Here's the workflows you can do. Here's how the apps work. Here's how the settings work. But then we handed to them like, okay, you have to, enter it in through the UI by yourself. You know your data. All the libraries do know actually what they have because they have a list somewhere that has due dates of when they have to pay the vendors. So they do have like some kind of list somewhere, some way, someone has it. They would have to take that list on their own and enter it in for all the details. That would reduce the time on our end, and it would also mean the libraries have complete control over how it's they don't get to hear me weigh in on anything. They just put it in their way on their own time. The con of that approach is this is a lot of extra work for libraries that are already like doing a lot of migration work and very, like the other aspects of this with coordinating circulation rules and many inventory loads and data checks and stuff like that. These libraries were overwhelmed already. And so asking them to do work in an area that they don't actually often have a lot of experience with would have been hard for them. And kind of related to that, in a migration period, especially in the last like 6 months of it, we were talking the time frame of this, they went live in May, June this year, 2024. The work for this was taking place from like November, December onward. And, when you're getting into that last push, the last kind of period of the migration, folks are like they're dropping everything that's not needed in their mind. And if they have never done ERM before, that's going to be one of the first things that was going to go. And it was very clear, like talking to them, that's what would have happened. So I kind of thought about it and talked to them. We proposed a method that I had started using in other libraries, which is using knowledge-based data. Whether in this case, most of them were on holdings management, EBSCOs, KB, HLM, using package lists from that source and using the vendors and packages from that and the dates that are in there to pre-populate essentially their ERM agreements and organizations for them. Kind of based on the assumption that, well, they've gone into their holdings management, they've made these selections, someone from their institution has made these selections intentionally or somewhat intentionally, and it's probably reasonably accurate. Not going to be 100% accurate because that's not any knowledge base in my experience, but it's a way that we can get at what they have without them having to like kind of go through on their own and generate it themselves. So this was a pro because it was HLM is the same. The reports we're able to get internally at EBSCO, and the libraries can actually get in their own holdings management is the same data, same column, same fields. And for us, it's easily obtained. So one thing in data migration is, the library has to provide the data in whatever format, and it can come in many formats, right? And sometimes half the project is getting the data in a workable format to get into FOLIO, right? And you can end up doing a lot of data massaging, not a lot of data massaging. And other things like, who in the library gets the data to you and stuff like that. Well, we sidetracked all that. It would have been very diverse sources of data for 60 libraries. It would have been different people. Some places would not really even know where that data is because they don't have people, or the people left, turnover, stuff like that. It would have been, some of it would have been from Sierra. Some of it would have been various non-standardized spreadsheets. This is all the same format, and I can pull it all myself without having to rely on the libraries to provide it or have someone that knows where it is. So in terms of like a data migration perspective, that's really a benefit. The con was, and we'll talk about this some more, it was the scalability of this. So yes, I can go get all data, but I have to go download 60 reports and then take that data, pre-process it quite a bit in Excel per spreadsheet, and then take that data and turn it into lists that then get loaded essentially. And we'll talk about the details of that, but that's a lot of time. And we'll see how long it took later on in the presentation. And then another con is this may miss local ERM data. So the data that's kind of missing in this kind of approach is any contact information. So vendor contact information, sales contact information, phone numbers, stuff like that, support, emails, all the kind of stuff that if you're doing ERM and you're trying to troubleshoot or you're doing renewal, that information is very local. It's also usually generally hard to track for any library. It's in emails, it's in people's spreadsheets. You're also missing things like administrative passwords, like logging in to get usage statistics to check your holdings, whether it's like, EBSCO admin or ProQuest admin for the databases, stuff like that. All that is missing because I don't have access to that. So we rely on a review point in this process for the libraries to volunteer that information. And that is, your miles may vary depending on the library's engagement and capacity. So it's kind of balancing a lot of different things to find a workable solution for this. And what we ended up choosing, and by choosing, we didn't just make this choice on the vendor side unilaterally. Mobius, the central office, coordinated an electronic resource management working group of a fair amount of librarians, library staff that have done ERM in some capacity. We got together, and that was during summer. That was the summer of 2023, before the big migration started, to kind of talk through. I did a bunch of sessions on how ERM apps work. We kind of standardized what settings we were going to use, picking things like organization types and roles and stuff like that. And then I kind of gave them the options, and they talked about it. We talked about it several times, and they decided like, hey, we think if you don't do this, no one's going to use it, or it's going to be very, people are going to be overwhelmed and forget about it. And ERM projects always have a tendency to get deprioritized over time if they're not done right away. That was the feedback I got from them. So they recommended, I call this method the HLM method. It's not just necessarily dependent on EBSCO's HLM. You could do this, and I have done this for other libraries with Serious Solutions package data. You could probably do it with OKB package data. I don't know why you would drag OKB. You have much easier ways to get it into FOLIO than, duplicating it this way. But any sort of package list, you could probably even take like a Spring Share libguides export of databases and turn that into a list if you want to. So we chose that method with buy-in from them. And then we had to determine things. Like I mentioned, there's a certain amount of settings and kind of reference data that you need to have in the FOLIO ERM apps to kind of make it work ideally. So for organizations, that was organization types and contact categories. For licenses, that was what type of license terms to use. Do you want to customize it? Does the consortium want to come together and make their own? Do they want to edit the one that we kind of have, the community has, etc. they did choose to use kind of the standard one, and the standard one's pretty comprehensive. And then with agreements, they chose, there's the option of supplementary properties, and supplementary properties and agreements gives you lots of freedom and lots of choices, but it's also like very customizable and usually benefits more from a local choice than like a standardized choice. So we did decide, after talking about like what could be done, what did they want to track, what would they want to be able to easily take a list of agreements and reduce to a list, by filtering. And they agreed on being able to do, we did content type. And at the time, content type didn't exist as its own filter in the UI, and now it does. So we generated a list, went back and forth, and I'll show the list in a second of what content types we chose. We also created a supplementary property for subject, but we did not pre-populate it. We let the libraries know, hey, you probably, most of these libraries are academic. You probably have a list already that's, that these databases are for your history program and stuff like that. But it's very different for each library and each school. So we said, we'll put this here, and, when you get to it, populate it and stuff, and you can assign it. So it's there. That's kind of one where we, that they have to decide. And then we added agreement organization rules. So this is different than organization type. This is within an agreement. If you assign multiple organizations to it, what role do they play, right? Like EBSCO is a subscription agent, like the journal is actually from the Degroiter or something like that. So you'd have two organizations. One is the provider and one is the subscription agent. So here's kind of a list, or not a list of, these are screenshots of the various standardized rules we picked. You can see for org categories, we have account manager, billing and invoices, customer support, sales, and tech support. Then these were all agreed upon by the working group. So we didn't kind of just present these, we worked together, we spent a whole summer kind of coming up with these things. So org types, this kind of allows, to search by, they're all in the consortium, obviously, they're all in Mobius, the consortium. So there was a few other consortiums that they were part of, like purchasing groups. And the schools found it very useful to be able to say, like, what resources do we get through Mobius? Because Mobius also provides their subscription agent as well. So it was nice for some libraries to be like, well, we get these EBSCO databases through Mobius, and then these EBSCO databases we get direct. Just being able to know, because those very likely have different start and end dates. So you kind of see where this is going. Content type, we spent a lot of time on this one. And we changed some of the defaults in FOLIO. Some of these we added. The interesting one, I think, is like reports and library software tools. There's a few databases, especially like business databases, that are really not, journals or books. They're, like S&P, Net Advantage. That's just an example, right? Where they're reports, they're like economic data or world data. And reflect reports was a good one to do to classify those things. And then finally, for agreement role or roles, like I mentioned, consortium, content provider, subscription agent, and vendor. Vendor is different than content provider. Vendor is like if you use Gobi. Gobi's not a content provider, but they're also not a subscription agent, right? You buy something once on Gobi's platform, but it's from Taylor and Francis, or it's from ProQuest, or from EBSCO. So Gobi is just like the vendor in that scenario. There's not a lot of examples for that for e-resources. It's more of a print thing. So gathering the data. So I've kind of alluded to this already. So our main sources of data were holdings management. Those are the reports I mentioned. We supplemented that with two other sources. One was, as I mentioned, Mobius itself was a subscription agent. And Mobius obviously knows which members got stuff through them. So they were able to provide me a list with, start and end dates and everything. And I was able to add that to the data that we were building for each library. And then we also used EBSCOnet data. So EBSCOnet is a journal subscription agent that EBSCO has. Most of the libraries had titles to that. So we were able to use that source as well, another internal source. I was able to get them all in the same format from the EBSCOnet representative for Missouri. And it was very useful. We limited that to just online titles because a fair amount of libraries get print stuff still through EBSCOnet. So there was some pre-processing and filtering we had to do there. But we were able to kind of get this data, these resources of data, and kind of aggregate them per library. And so this is kind of a very high level overview of what happened. So we created, and there's probably much more efficient ways to do this now that I'm thinking about it, you know, a year later. But we created a folder and file structure for the libraries. So there's a folder with the library's name and then files in it. So the data files, HLM, EBSCOnet, Mobius. And then we added template files. So we have 2 template files we use, and they're more a file template we use when we are implementing a library and we give it to them to fill out. So it's an Excel file. It's not, you know, very sophisticated or JSON or whatever. It's an Excel document with, you know, the fields from the FOLIO record, whether it's agreements or organizations. The required ones are marked, you know, so you can enter the bare minimum. And we've created this tool before this project to help libraries kind of organize their thoughts before they put stuff into FOLIO. I've used it to kind of just allow me to take standardized data and transform it right into these columns. So we did that for each school. And that was most of my November and December of 2023 was pulling the data, combining it. At the time, this was a lot of VLOOKUPs in Excel. I have since learned enough Python to automate a bunch of this. That's something I learned after this project, sadly. But we combined all this data and deduplicated it. So I don't want to get too much into the details. I kind of presented on the method of this last year at WOLFcon, but we're using the vendor columns of these package lists, doing a pivot table on them, or, you know, to essentially do the deduping, right? You do a pivot table and then it's like, you know, even though you have 500 packages and 60 of them are from EBSCO, it only shows EBSCO once. I take that deduped list and that's the basis of the organization's list for an institution. I assign org codes. I have a standardized set of org codes that I've kind of built up over time. Kind of just showing what these things look like. These are taken from the command line. They're not like file structures. So the top, this one in the upper left is just a list of the folders. You can tell because they don't have a file extension. Here is an example of the scripts we're using. So that's another thing we used. I used shell scripts for this. Like I said, there's probably other much more automated ways of doing this than shell scripts, but this is what I knew and what had been tried and true in many projects in the 6 months before I did this. And then here is actually a combination of the files. So we've here at the top, you see I'm using ATSU, that's one of the schools as an example. These are kind of the data files used in the project. So transforming the data, I touched on this a bit. A few other things I had to do, it was kind of source specific. So in HLM, the data had a column that said free or open. Obviously, we don't need to migrate open access or free content into FOLIO. It's the point of FOLIO ERM is to manage paid content primarily. And that was something I talked through with the work group once again, and they agreed to me. And we don't need to have, you know, DOAJ as an agreement in our FOLIO. So I had to remove all that content. There was a filter for that. I also did some things with like filtering on the title column and filtering on anything that had the word free or open in it, which got rid of some things that were mislabeled in HLM. And then the remaining package names, we just use as the agreements from the HLM side of things. Did something similar with the Mobius data. It was a bit more easier to clean up than the HLM data. But that data, we also, from that data, we were able to get start and end dates, start dates being the required field for agreements or one of them. So that was really helpful. For EBSCOnet journal stuff, like I said, we limited to online only. We did a similar thing that we did for the HLM stuff with a publisher field. It's not called, or a vendor in that file. Added codes, added types. We added some of that reference data I mentioned already. I had like predetermined that, you know, for the EBSCOnet list, every single one of those titles got EBSCOnet as an organization type of subscription agent. And then I would use the publisher as the content provider. So each of those titles or packages, depending on how we did it, got at least one, if not two organizations ultimately attached to that agreement when I went in. So reviewing the data. So I did a lot of this data processing work in November, December of 2023. Their go live was June 2020. So what that meant was we essentially got the new year, after the new year, to give the data back to them to review. So this is a really kind of important step, I think, in it, is not just generating this data and then loading them and then they got to pick up the pieces, is because it's in Excel format in each individual school, like I don't think very many of them had more than 200 or 200 agreements max. They were, like I said, they're kind of small schools. The data was not super overwhelming for them to review. So they went through, I gave them time to review. I said, delete anything that this, if it's in HLM, but you don't know why it's there, which happens in every knowledge base. Why is this on? Is it turned on? When did they get turned on? Delete stuff, add stuff. Please add start dates if they're not there, because we can't put this in without a start date. And I'd rather not. I had a policy that we'd agreed on that if they didn't provide a start date or if they didn't know it, I would just put in like January 1 as a placeholder, and they would have to go back when they renewed at whatever time and change it. So we could get the stuff in there. It wasn't like, if you don't give me anything, we're not going to put it in. I tried to be open and accepting of that. They also got to add some of that an opportunity to add some of that local data that I mentioned is missed in this particular approach. So they were able to each put in contact information for their vendors if they wanted to. They could put in license data. Only a few schools did licenses, maybe one or two actually out of 60. So those actually were mostly not part of this process. Those were kind of a la carte afterwards. They added some like I said, there was a category for library software. So folks that had libguides or OCLC products like what's it called? Connection, stuff like that got added. If they had like SPSS software in their library, they counted that as an e-resource that was put in, stuff like that. So after a month, we gave them a certain time, and then we took the reviewed and updated data and said, okay, now we're going to start loading because you've signed off. We have this process. Like, you're signing off on the data. You're good with this. We're going to start loading. And we have to load because now it's the end of January, early February, and we're going to be starting to load like the big data. This is actually the small data of our project. The big data is how many records? 20 or 10 million? Yeah, 10 million inventory records and users for 60 schools, like much bigger sets of data than we're talking about here. And so kind of folding it back into the larger project where logical, different things are going. And it's not like this uses enough CPU or memory in a FOLIO instance to block that sort of thing, but kind of trying to, once again, be mindful of the capacity of the libraries to kind of review data that's going into FOLIO. So most of February and into March, I was loading these, and I load them one by one. This is a very high level overview of what happened. So you saw the scripts, we set up authentication, the data is in a secure place because it's not like user information, but it's still the library's data. And we load. And I don't want to go too much into the details of the loading process because I get to cover that in a different presentation, but it was, running 2 or 3 at the minimum scripts per organization load and per agreement load. So really running like 6 scripts per institution and then checking the data that's in there and then moving on to the next one, So like I said, definitely probably a better way to do this, but the way that the architecture was set up then, this was the only way, or to have 10 people put it all in manually, which I didn't think we decided that was not the approach we wanted to take. So here's kind of a diagram version. I love diagrams. I have a reputation. And this is kind of a diagram version that's a little bit simplified, but kind of shows the data sources. It does not include the Mobius source of data, because that was kind of relatively small one in the scheme of things. But you can see we start with multiple documents one, there's one for each library here, one for each library here. And then that data gets divided out. The organizations go here, agreement, package information goes here, one for each library. So the number of these and the number of these are the same for each library. And then they get loaded based on the field data using APIs. And then at the end of the day, we have 61 sets of organizations and agreements across 61 subtenants of Folio. These are not all going into the same Folio tenant. They're going to distinct, like sandboxed tenants. None of the data is shared. If it was shared, this would have been a lot easier in some ways. Ooh. So after that, they get another period of review. Obviously, they want to see what the data looks like in Folio, because it's it's one thing to look at it in a spreadsheet, it's another thing to see it in the system, do some test searches. It wasn't too much data. They were pretty happy with it, or they just didn't have time to look at it, because we're talking March, April, and we're doing a lot of, I think we're pretty close to data freeze for everything at this point, the rest of the project. Some of these libraries only have one person doing the whole migration. So we did some data adjustments for them. I didn't have to reload anything. I just had to add more things. Libraries had questions mostly of how they should proceed, so I gave them some guidance. I did a presentation earlier today about how to use dashboards to kind of tie up loose ends and stuff. They talked about that with them. We activated, so in Folio, in EBSCO Folio, we have the eHoldings app, which is API connection to HLM. So your HLM, essentially your knowledge base, your EBSCO knowledge base activations show up in this app. And there's a way you can connect them to the agreements via agreement lines. There's not really an automated way to do that, because mostly we use HLM packages as a one-to-one for agreements, but in some cases we don't. If there's if all of your EBSCO stuff is all done in one invoice and it all has the same data, the date of renewal, and there's not a ton of reason to split them out individually unless you want to really go into subject, categories and stuff like that. So in some cases, some libraries collapse their titles. If you have a big deal, like a big deal subscription to Sage, you're not going to put in 2,000 Sage titles into your agreements necessarily. You're going to put in Sage Premier 2024, 2025 as your package agreement name, and then maybe you attach a title list, and then you attach the actual access point in HLM, the Sage Premier 2024 package, to that agreement. They had to do that manually. So we turned it on for them, because by default their folios, out of the box aren't activated that way. And then we said, here you go, here's how you should do it. You don't have to do it all at once. You can do it. I like to encourage libraries to kind of, if there's more data they want to add, to do it within the annual renewal cycle. So, at some point you're going to, at least with recurring subscriptions, you're going to touch it and have to deal with it once a year. And that's the time to fill in more data. For a few libraries, we were also about to embark on the acquisition migration, which is a much smaller subset of libraries, but also the same kind of scenario. It's not covered by ECS, so we have to do it one by one. We had about 20 libraries that did acquisitions. Only about 10, half of them, maybe, I don't remember the numbers, actually migrated their orders from their CR into. But part of that was to have an order record in Folio, you have to have an organization vendor record attached to it. So we had to sync up the organizations I'd already put in from the ERM side of things with organizations that were in Sierra. So that was a bit more work. And that happened in May, right before their big go live. But that wrapped it up, and Mobius was live on ERM before the actual. So they were live by the end of April, beginning of May, so they could use it. They were functionally live. They could start doing stuff. It's disconnected right from inventory for the most part. It's disconnected from, they're not really live on acquisitions yet. So the libraries can start using it. And I think they did. I was just talking to someone from Mobius today, and they said it's going along well. Here's just kind of a higher level timeline of how long this took. This is more of like a project management kind of things. So like I said, end of summer 2023, we're having that work group form. We're having discussions about what they want to do, what is possible. this is a representative group, so there's not 60 people in this group. There's like 10 speaking for everyone else. Elected, I don't know if they're elected. I think they were volunteers. And we kind of determined everything, and then we started on it. This is the initial data gathering and processing phase. Me by myself in November, pulling stuff down and putting it together, then giving it to the libraries to review, add stuff, delete stuff, etc. Then right after that, I started loading. After the data is loaded, they get the review period, and then we activate e-holdings. So then that's really the way we treat ERM migrations on our team, at least, is when we activate e-holdings, because e-holdings is connected to HLM, and HLM ultimately controls the journal list. EBSCO's full text finder, publication finder, and it indirectly controls what shows up in EBSCO discovery. And that means you can do stuff in FOLIO that affects your live discovery system. We call it going live with ERM because it is live. What you do and it affects users. So like I said, we ended up being live on April. So live probably a month and a half before the rest of the project, which was by design. It wasn't like a race to see which one could be done. It was get this out of the way and let them focus on like the big data thing. So just wanted to talk about, we did talk about the pros and cons before, but this is kind of a reflective piece of, what was the benefit of this approach taken? It was a lot of work, obviously, and a lot of communication, a lot of decision-making early on, and continuous communication throughout, and that's just kind of part of the implementation project. But I like to think it was a systematic and standardized approach. Everyone is getting data from their HLM in the same fields. They're getting the same categories, which is important, I think, for a consortium like theirs, because they're kind of really starting to go into electronic resource management. And the more that they start from the same place and same understanding, I think they can work and get this kind of feedback, the more that they can kind of rely on each other to continue to evolve their ERM approaches, in their kind of consortial community moving forward. Another thing that goes without saying, like member participation and buy-in, getting people that engaged and feeling like they're part of the process. And even if they're not particularly confident or familiar with electronic resource management or even knowledge bases, some of them were just starting discovery for the first time, a few months before we started this project. So really they're going from just doing cataloging an OPAC to having index-based discovery. It's a lot of big changes. I think, it puts them in a better spot than if we just handed them templates and said, we've shown you how ERM works. You fill out the data and put it in your stuff. And the third point, like I said, it encourages folks to use ERM. Like it's there, we're giving them a starting point. Is it 100% accurate? Probably not. Actually, absolutely not. But it gives them something to start with. Like I think our feeling was if they have something in the system to look at, they can start from there. Maybe they have a really brief records, but they can fill them out over time instead of finding time to start from scratch again and again and again. Lessons learned, future process improvements. I've kind of hinted at this already. Increased scalability. I am not here to talk about ECS functionality, but extending ECS functionality to the ERM apps at some point. So you could have, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with Alma, but Alma has like the network zone in it. And, if in the consortial system, you can turn something on and it kind of populates downward, something like that, where, I could have taken a list of all the resources that everyone in Mobi has had, which is a fair amount of things. And I could have just put them in once instead of locally 60 times. Something like that would make this kind of consortial situation for ERM a lot easier. Better ways to incorporate local ERM admin data. This is a really hard one because it really depends on the libraries and where they're at with their existing organization. We can't demand it of them. Really, I'm not, I'm certainly going to encourage that. So how is there a better way to get that information from the libraries in that scenario? I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to that, but it's something that if we can improve it, I would love to improve it. And then improve load script efficiency. There's a whole nother probably presentation that I would probably not be leading because I like I said, I learned Python, but that's Panda. When I say Python, I mean Pandas specifically, which is a small subset of Python that pretty much allows me to automate VLOOKUPs, and that's it. There's probably better ways to do it. So far, Mobius has been the only institution, only implementation that has required this kind of scale. So there hasn't been enough incentive to like really dive into that more. But as more libraries do this kind of migration, it might make more sense for us to investigate better ways to do it than having me loaded individually or any other person. So I'm at the end. I haven't looked at a clock in a while, and I should have. So I think we have 15 minutes. I'm going to check the chat really quick, see if no one has said anything. So opening it up for questions.
Did you surf on Elvis? That's all I got at.
Did I? I don't think so. No, it would have been. I don't have this nerdy and response time. Without turning one of those elephants into like a 60-headed Hydra elephant. But if I had better scripts, it would have been more like that, more smooth. But I had better knowledge to manipulate the scripts. Clarifying for the author of the script sitting in the corner here.
No, they were bad, so they were designed for another purpose and adapted on their time.
Owen sitting in the back, the first.
So first of all, thanks so much for the presentation.
Yep.
I think that description of the structure and that discussion of like planning of the implementation, I think is a really valuable use case, and would definitely recommend people give thought to the same kind of questions that you were asking in the Mobius consortium, but obviously for individual institutions as well. I wanted to I will also just promote, we are having some sessions on ERM on workflows in tomorrow and Thursday. And while not directly, like this idea of being able to manipulate data in ERM, like, and have that automated is part of the workflows discussion.
Okay.
So, and I've seen some demonstrations of, for instance, work done at Stanford where they use some workflow software to do that kind of manipulation, not for ERM specifically, but for other. And I think at SSA&M, who are developing the workflow module, they have done that with ERM using their workflow software. So please come along to that tomorrow. Not just sorry. But I had a question.
Sure.
Was you mentioned how at the end of the process you've done all the planning, the data loading, but the allocation of resources to particular agreements wasn't something you could automate because there isn't a kind of given rule that says like
yes,
this is how it should be grouped.
Right. Even though I used AHLM as literally like the titles of these agreements would have matched what's in eHoldings.
Yeah.
There was enough variation, like I said, in the scenarios where like we're not going to put in each EBSCO host database, we're going to put it all in one.
Yeah.
Which would have not matched, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing, there's a few other like silly details. So the source of data I use for HLM doesn't share the same KB IDs that are in FOLIO.
Right.
I found this out the hard way. So there's not like an ID-based way to do it right now. And I just, if I had more time, the timing was like everything else was there and it was fast. It would have been faster for me and with the resources our team had at the time to just do this or to have them. And we've, do we want to do it eventually? Yes. But do our client, like libraries ask about like, well, I have to do this manually? Yes, you do.
Yeah.
And
I guess that was
but there's different ways to do it too. So like, once again, like, and we talk about this all the time in the ERM sake. Like there's some people attach titles as agreement lines. Some people just do a one-to-one with even though the eHoldings package has like 20 titles in it, they're just going to the package level, right? And without breaking that down 60 times with people who have not thought about that at all, that level, it just didn't that makes sense to fit into the project.
So I think, given all that, I know what the answer is.
Oh, no.
I will ask it anyway. Like, do you think there's anything we could do in the ERM module that would make that particular part of the discussion or the process better?
For the e-holdings, for the agreement line?
Actually, exactly the same problem would apply. I think no matter what knowledge base you were using, because this question about like what is the best possible way of grouping what is already is like it's not a question that you can give a single answer to. So I don't think that it's not the whole particularly, although if you want to give the answer on the use perspective, because that's your experience. If there was anything that we could think about doing in the application that would somehow make the decision making easier or the implementation of that decision easier.
Yeah, sorry. I was listening. Oh, but I'm just, my adapter is not.
Let me say the very beginning part of the question.
So, given the challenge that Zorian describes is that when you have these discussions about exactly how do you want to use agreements, because agreements in FOLIO don't directly map necessarily to real world
Correct.
like items or like
Right.
there's you can use them in slightly different ways, and they do have some constraints around them, like they exist, they have a start and end date, and they have one license, one active license, and they have a set of resources. And so given those constraints, you can then decide to use them how you would want.
Right.
And my question was like, and because people make different decisions, you can't just say like, well, here's the things that are active in your knowledge base, therefore these are the agreements we should create. I mean, you could come up with some rules, but then you would like find that some people disagree. With
Right,
the
and
decision.
we found that, right? And I guess I think I see what you're saying is like this is maybe a more prescriptive approach with ERM data than maybe like what was intentioned with the apps. But it's the question of like scalability
My
and
question
knowledge.
Is there anything we could do on the app side, on the agreement side, to either make the decision making there easier? So like maybe even constrain more, or just have models to say this is this type of agreement, or I don't know.
I do tell libraries I have some like informal, semi-formal rules, and I mentioned them to some extent already. Like if you have a bunch of EBSCOnet databases and they're all in the same invoice and they presumably have the same start and end date, subscription dates, it makes much more sense to put them in one agreement than to break them out, right? But in a different case that I mentioned, if you get some EBSCO host databases through a consortia and you get other ones direct, you want to know that, and they're probably going to have different dates.
Yeah.
And you're going to know that because they're going to have different organizations. So there's a lot of like logic, and I'm starting to like kind of codify at least internally for our implementations, but there is some logic. Like same thing with EBSCOnet or Horasowitz or any sort of journal subscription agent where you may get some big deals where you have, like 1,500 titles like Wiley, or you may get 20 Oxford University titles. They're not in a package or anything. You just get 20 titles. Depending on how those dates work, and once again, you can put that in as Oxford University Press journals, just the way it's represented in the knowledge base, or you can put them in individually. I tell people to put them in individually because if you want to track perpetual access in the long run, you're going to want to know at the title level, and you can indicate that in an agreement.
Yeah.
So there is logic, and I just like haven't written it down in this presentation, but right. But I would argue, I guess it's your question, that the flexibility to take those approaches is there currently with how it's set up. I think the biggest thing that would make things easier would be to have a UI-based upload feature. And I know we've talked about this.
Yeah,
but-
I mean, I mean, that's clear to me from the presentation.
Yeah.
And like, that's why I didn't ask about that, because I kind of get that.
That was from last year too.
Yeah,
But, and I know that it, you know, I've talked about it with other PLs like Kalila, and it's like, well, what's the use case for it when you're not migrating? And well, there is a few. Look, one thing, this is kind of getting beyond the scope of this presentation, but like every year, if you have annual agreements, your start and end dates are going to go forward by one. Right. And you have to do right now, you have to do that manually one by one by one by one. And if you're touching everything once a year, one by one, that makes sense. But it would be nice if there was like some way to define in the settings, like a default period for agreements. So like, unless specified, it's the current, you know, calendar or fiscal year.
Yeah.
And they would auto increment, you know, given certain circumstances. I think that would save a lot of work for folks too. Because a lot of libraries are like, well, how do I automate as much as possible? And it's like, well, you don't want to automate. You can't automate everything. You shouldn't. That's maybe a subjective opinion, but like,
I definitely think that this is a relevant workplace conversation, which, so, I mean, that, I don't want to, well, I definitely don't want to say like, workflows is doing this and so we don't have to worry about it, because I don't think that's the case. But I do think that the workflows might offer a very flexible approach to that kind of automation that we could make use of. But if we decide, if the decision or the conclusion of that workflows discussion, if the workflows module isn't going to support this in a great way, then we should implement it, right? So it's like that discussion is really important to me, because the question of like, where are the things that have the opportunity to be done more flexibly by this workflow solution, which should allow things like automation of like, when you hit this date, then do X, Y, and Z to all the agreements that meet these criteria. Like that's one thing. On the other hand, like if the workflow solution isn't going to deliver that or not soon enough, then obviously it's something we should think about building directly into the application instead.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Owen. Is there any other questions, comments?
So maybe that's a dumb question, but basically there is like a step missing between an agreement and the resource, which is the subscription. Like the subscription would be the one thing that's renewed every year, and the agreement would be the thing holding the subscriptions, because technically it probably is. And you would then, if you cancel the agreement, all subscriptions would be canceled. And like, I think there's some like a
the granularity, there's a level of granularity missing. Yeah. So what I like, I'm on an implementation is my role, and we have to kind of standardize things that we do. And one of the things that I like to, people ask, what is the difference between a license and agreement? That question comes up every single, and I say the license, the license record in FOLIO is the legal part of the document. And I literally do this gesture, and I mentioned like the PDF, the document you get from the vendor. The first half of it that has the legal stuff, that's what's in the license. And the stuff at the bottom of it, the addendums and appendices that list out, all the EBSCOhost databases you have, all the titles in your Sage Premier package, stuff like that. That's what's in the agreement. Your agreements are the entitlements you get from the vendor that are included in that second part of the license, right? So that's the definition I start from. Now, like, that's not like the one and only FOLIO definition of what can be done, but that's what I use to start to orient the rest of this kind of implementation and how I recommend libraries organize their ERM. So I don't know if that helps clarify, but like I said, with the dates and stuff, just still scenarios where you want to have more granularity, and the agreement record versus an agreement line. The agreement record currently has a lot more fields and ways to store information than an agreement line. And that's why I advocate like perpetual access. Perpetual access can be tracked in the license too, but the license is just, it's not title specific. And with perpetual access, if you're doing adds and cancels, or let's say you lose access, the journal goes from Wiley to Sage, right? You're still going to have perpetual access to the years you've subscribed on Wiley, and you want to know that. And how are you going to remember that without leaving that agreement on and having it, and remember to leave it on in the knowledge base that provides the article level access based on that coverage cutoff. So that's why I advocate for that. That's a very detailed scenario, but it's not an uncommon one, right? So I don't know if that helps clarify. Not a silly question at all. Oh,
I just wanted to add, the subscription is actually on the purchase order line. So the purchase order line has subscription built on it.
right.
The purchase order line can connect to the agreement line. So the agreement line, purchase order line is where the subscription, like in the sense of a renewable thing that you pay for on a regular basis. You would have invoices against that order line, obviously, and that's the link to the subscription, to what we might, the subscription element of everything. So that happens at the agreement line level. Although I think it's fair to say that integration is, or that the way those things work together is not as well seen, not as seamless as I would like, because there's those things are kind of grown up separately, and it's possible to use agreements without orders. So like then we've got to decide how you manage that.
I was gonna say, is there an equivalent, potential equivalent entity for ERM applications to the e-holdings or the knowledge base record as an order line? As an agreement line alongside orders, like a subscription agreement line. It's a separate entity that only affects subscriptions.
I mean, I think that's there would be some advantages to that, I think, but because it would mean that you didn't have to have an order to have a subscription, which you do at the moment. But I think that that's true for other things as well. Like that doesn't just apply to electronic resources. So in a folio sense, it doesn't make complete sense to me that you manage that solely within the ERM apps, but you want something that can operate in the acquisitions arena that can then apply to multiple things. So I think there is an argument for it, definitely. Although I think I'd start by just improving the subscription functionality on the order line.
Yeah, if that, I mean, yeah, $0 POLs and the non-roaming POLs.
Yeah. So I think there are definitely improvements to be made there. But I think the pieces are, and probably play with the pieces we've got first rather than invent new pieces. Yeah, but it's another component though, of like deciding like, do I need an agreement line for this? Because if there's an order line for it, and you want to track that against a specific like resource, you need an agreement line at the resource level, or you can have multiple order lines for a single agreement line, but you can't know which resource points to do. So like, if you have a package of resources with 5 journals in, they all have their own DOL. If you create one agreement line for the package and then add 5 order lines to it, that's kind of done the job of stating how these things are related, but there's no specific link from the order line through to the resource or the specific resource. You just said one of the things in this package has this order line attached to it, and that's a little less precise. And for reporting, that makes it like, okay, how much did I spend on this title? You can't answer anymore. So it's like, it's not, that's not great. So then if you do one agreement line per title, you can do that mapping directly, but you end up with a proliferation of agreement lines, which adds to an administrative overhead, which you may not want. And that's like where one of those areas where I kind of like the flexibility is great, but then you will have to make this decision rather than me or product telling you this is the decision you're making. And that brings cognitive overhead to you, which is the kind of reason why you have long implementation projects which have these discussions about product.
All right, thank you, Owen. It is time. I do not want to get in the way of folks in their meal later today. Thank you, everyone. Those who attended in person and online. Thanks for bearing with me on this technology. But yeah, have a good rest of your day, everyone.